So, well, again, we're very lucky again to have Professor Abdabra in conversation about her views about directions and history of the study of racism and other related issues. Again, people will probably be very familiar with Abda's work and role in the whole discipline. She's been a very influential figure around bringing together debates about gender, race and class. Very, very formative work around the study of diaspora. As I've said to Abda before, that when I'd ask slightly more junior than me colleagues about who else should we ask, and people who are very much working in diaspora studies, they really requested that we asked you. And I think that's a good indication of how people kind of build those family connections, even if they don't know you yet. They say, oh yes, this is a chance to make that. She's written a whole range of very influential books, including Cartographies of Diaspora, key member of the editorial board of Feminist Review, founder member of Southern Black Sisters, I've forgotten completely, you sent me. But also, again, someone who's played a key role in, I'm sure, many people in the room's intellectual and professional trajectory. And so some of what we want to talk about is, again, what is this project that we're engaged in together? Now, let me check that the mic is up.
Oh, yes, it's on.
Excellent. Perfect. Right. Right. So the first question is really to start a little bit with what brought you into academic knowledge and what allowed you to address those intersectional issues at a time when that intersectional debate was not really being.
Well, I came into academia in an indirect sort of way. I hadn't actually intended to be in academia. I finished my studies in the US, in California and Wisconsin, and I came to Britain for a short holiday, so to speak, which became a longish holiday. Partly it wasn't a holiday really, because I became a refugee when Idi Amin decided to expel Asians from Uganda. And so then I had to look for a job. And I started looking, and there was a job going at Bristol University. And they were looking for an interviewer who could speak Punjabi. So I could speak Punjabi, I could speak Urdu. So I applied, and I got that job. And so I really started as an interviewer. And then, as I started working on these issues, I became quite interested in them. So that was the intellectual trajectory from there. But in terms of the kind of activism side, that starts with experiences of racism in this country. Although I had been in America and that I experienced sort of the kind of racialization, it wasn't the same as being a racialized person in Britain, you know, where I was a post-colonial subject. It was a very different experience, and I could then begin to understand what it used to be like for Black Africans, African Americans in the US actually. And so that is how I came into academia and started work on academia, but simultaneously I also became involved in feminist politics. So when I was in Bristol, I remember going to conscious raising groups and attended some feminist conferences, but found that questions of race were not really addressed in those conferences. Whereas when I was looking at questions of race, then questions of gender were not addressed. So I began to think that really we have to bring these together. And of course I was a socialist, and therefore questions of class were very important to me. And therefore really that's where my intellectual and political trajectory kind of started, mulling around how to think through the relationships between, we didn't call it intersectionality, but we used to say race, class and gender was the word at that time, you know. How do we think through this? How do we look at the interlinks between that? And that's how really it started for me.
Can I just ask, is the sound better for people? Is it audible? I'm not hearing anyone saying yes. Is that a yes?
Yes.
At the back?
That's
right.
Good.
Okay, good.
That's good. That's good.
Thank so, you've already started to say this, that a lot of the reason why a whole generation of people look to you is because of that bringing together of intellectual and political work. I know it's not only you alone, but there's a moment when that was such a strong kind of set of connections around academic work around race and gender in this country. And I wondered if you could say something about how that dialogue happened in that moment. You already said like it needed to happen.
Yes.
But how did it carry on?
It was a very collective project in a way, because I was also involved, and I mean, we'll probably come to this a bit later on, but I became involved through my awareness, growing awareness about questions of racism and links to gender and class. I became aware of how once I was a bit disillusioned with the politics of the white feminist movement at the time, and we didn't talk in that language, white feminism, black feminism, I decided, I wondered how best to go forward. And together with some other women who we called ourselves black at the time, I know that actually terminology doesn't have the same balance these days, but at the time we came together. It was mainly, again at the time, given the demography of people of color in this country, it was mainly African, Caribbean, and Asian people. And borrowing from, some of the kind of work from America, we actually called ourselves black. So it was a political color, black. And we started organizing. And as you organize, you also realize that as a woman, you're not just a woman, you're also a class person, you're also a person, disability. All of these kind of intersections come together. And that was how Southern Black Sisters actually started, really, because I remember I was involved in a similar, Black Sisters was the title of these groups. First I was involved in one in Bristol, and then in Southall, and then later on in Leicester. But out of those, I think Southall Black Sisters is still very active. And so it was very much a collective work. And that work that was going on outside the academy fed into my thinking in terms of my actually intellectual project.
Can I ask you a little bit about how that kind of thinking was then received in the academy, given that this comes from social movements largely outside?
Yes. Well, I mean, as John said this morning, it wasn't very easy in those days to actually bring questions of race, racism, ethnicity, gender, class on the mainstream curriculum of universities. So, in fact, I often say it was a hard struggle. I experienced it as a hard struggle to bring those questions. We had even sort of our professors who were working on questions of race were resistant to looking at questions of gender, and so we didn't get a lot of support. So it was actually quite a stressful time in that sense. But we continued because we were working collectively. It meant that you weren't totally on your own, and that's a lesson I think we learned today as well. That don't isolate yourself, because isolation will breed sort of exhaustion, really. Whereas you need other people to work with.
And can I also ask the extent to which those kinds of political groups and social movements that you worked with also felt that the academic and intellectual project was part of the movement, or whether it was seen as an activity apart?
Well, I think it was seen as, those of us who were involved in both saw it as joining up. But those who were not within the academy did see it as an activity apart. So it depended on who you were and where you were. But there were a lot of professional groups as well. It's not just the academy and outside the academy. A lot of professional groups, teachers, social workers, community workers, it was all kinds of people who were really involved in that. And we're talking about the 80s, which was actually a political turmoil. The whole country was in political turmoil. As we know, you know, the riots of 1981, 85, and in 1979, which was when South of Black Sisters was formed, we had the National Front march into Southall, and the local community came out to oppose them, and the place was full of police. And as those of you are familiar with that history, you know, there was a massive kind of confrontation between the police and the people, and over 300 people were arrested. Blair Peach was killed, and we had to have long-term sort of, you know, campaigns to free those people who had been arrested and to kind of, you know, get their charges dropped. So it was actually politically a very, but in some senses it was negative, but it was also a very energizing moment when people were coming together and working together of different backgrounds.
And that coming together, as you've described, partly came out of this moment of crisis.
It was a crisis, yes. The crisis that
brought
us together.
But I think that's important for people now to hear, because
yes.
in a moment of crisis where people seem to feel very sunken, whereas moments of crisis are where solidarity might be for all students. It's not political.
No, that's okay.
Sorry, so quickly move into speech mode, it's like shaking myself. Okay. As I've already said, and as many people know from your work, you, with others, really transformed the awareness around black feminism in this country. I think not only in the academy, I think more broadly, the embrace for many women of colour of that term is about a certain kind of activist intellectual nexus that happened. And I wondered if you could say a bit more about that journey, and a bit more about what kinds of collaborations went on to transform consciousness in political, scholarly and artistic and other arenas, because we've also, of course, mentioned, of course, it's other kinds of professional space. About anti-racist education was very key to that. The debate in social work about anti-discriminatory practice was very central. So I wondered if you could say some more about the kind of forging of black feminist consciousness.
Yes. It was across the board. And I was involved in, while I was finishing my PhD, I started work at Bristol, but then as always happens, the money ran out, and I had to look for a job. But I hadn't finished my PhD yet. So I came to Southall actually to work as a community worker. So I finished my PhD while I was working as a community worker, and worked with a lot of community workers who were involved in politics against racism. And in terms of feminism, I think we worked around a lot of issues of immigration, for instance, were very important. So we used to hold sessions for local people about immigration advice, support and advice. We campaigned against factory closures, against people who were working in factories but were discriminated against, like the Trix factory in Slough. We were involved in that. So we were actually involved in a lot of different kinds of both work-related, professional, intellectual kind of projects, but at the same time, you know, also involved in struggles on the ground. There was also another contestation, which was with white feminism. And as you said, that I've been a member of Feminist Review for a very long time. And a lot of these debates actually occurred in the pages of Feminist Review, which was a socialist feminist project, and, which is why I think I found my intellectual and political home there. And we used to, the thing was people used to think you were organizing as black people, then you're excluding others. But we had to argue that subordinate groups they need to actually organize from a position of strength. So every organization, whatever group, even if it's clubs and things you form, you exclude somebody. But that doesn't mean that you exclude other people from working with you politically. So that was important, that although we worked as black women, we worked with men on issues of racism and class politics. We also worked with white women on other gender issues that kind of affected us broadly. And as black women, we had to deal with both patriarchal practices within society as a whole, within Britain as a whole, but at the same time, patriarchal practices within our own communities. So the two had to happen at parallel. So in terms of organizing, we had to organize within our communities. I think that's quite important. We were discussing this over tea, how important it is actually to organize within communities so that our histories are not lost. We were discussing earlier on about the Black History Month, which actually, even though it's 1 month, but nonetheless, it actually foregrounds certain things that get lost and got forgotten. And we were discussing how the young people say in Southall, which is my formative political time, they don't know that history that we're talking about now. They're not aware of that. So in terms of thinking about the futures of anti-racist struggles, I think we need to think about the community, we need to think about the academy, obviously what kind of intellectual work we do. But at the same time, we also have to think about various ways in which we can bring these struggles together.
I wanted to ask you a little bit about black feminism today, because in some ways I've been very encouraged by the ways in which a younger generation of women have really re-energized what feminism in this country is, and in a very kind of activist mode, almost a kind of, at worst, a kind of anti-intellectual mode, but about just go and be there, kind of use your body to be there. And just from the outside, my strong sense is that that new wave is very influenced by debates on black feminism. That women of all ethnicities, I'm seeing younger women, that if my feminism is not intersectional, it's bullshit. There's a kind of claiming of that. I wonder, how do you think that has come about, or even just what your response has been?
No, I think like you, I feel very positive about it. And what is interesting is, although some people look a bit kind of askance when you mention black in that political color today, but there is a group of women in London, outside London, who are organizing as political black as well, even today. And that's a younger generation, completely sort of, so in a way, I think that the politics we were involved in didn't disappear, They sort of incubated with new generations. And the new generations are now, with Black Lives Matter and all kinds of sort of projects like that, are beginning to kind of take on the sorts of issues that we used to fight around.
Absolutely, and including, I have to say, workplace struggles, which
Absolutely.
for a while I think was not so present in the British anti-racist movement.
Yes.
But now, many of those overlapping groups of younger activists around Sisters of the Club, around Black Lives Matter, around a National Union of Students, I also see them at things which are around migrant workers' rights, which are around strikes. It's getting sewn back together, despite the state's best efforts to kind of imprison us all.
Exactly.
So, nearly at the end of my yes, you said that certainly within this country, your book on cartographies of diaspora really shifted the debate. It inspired a lot of work. Can you say a little bit about how you come to work on diaspora?
Well, at the time, the general discourse about talking about minority ethnic groups used to be either as immigrants, that was, or as ethnic minorities. And they both had racialized connotations. If people used the term immigrant, you knew exactly who they were referring to. At the same time, of course, for those of us who come from different parts of the world, then the nation state was not enough, actually. So nation-centric discourses were not something that was sufficient to analyze our experiences. And so diasporic groups always work with a transnational imaginary. And that transnational imaginary could not really be fully understood or analyzed with reference to terms like immigrants or ethnic minorities, not even minority ethnic, but ethnic minorities. So minoritizing us at the same time as racializing us. And so that's how I actually began to think about it. And of course, people like Stuart Hall was writing about using the term diaspora. And I felt, yes, I think I quite like that. I like that valorization, the term diaspora. And then I went away to California for a year, actually had a sabbatical year. Because here I was working in an extramural studies department where, you hardly had any time to do any thinking or writing. And so I actually began to think about diaspora as a concept. I mean, as Clifford says, diaspora is a concept, it's also an experience, it's also sets of discourses. And I said, well, how do we actually kind of think those through and try to analyze them as interrelated but independent analytics, So that's how I started thinking about diaspora as a concept, trying to actually differentiate it from experiences and from thinking of diaspora as an investigative technology, really, as a sort of Foucauldian genealogy is what I started thinking about. And then diaspora space came out of that thinking, because I was thinking about the borders, the bordering practices that we were surrounded by. And also thinking about politics of location, which was a feminist concept. So it was about feminist politics of location, both in terms of home and belonging, but also in terms of situatedness, our situatedness across intersectional axes, gender, class, sexuality. We didn't, as I said, at the time talk about intersectionality, but politics of location was very much about intersectionality, actually. And so for me, these three things coming together kind of was something which could enable you to look at the encounters between different categories of people, different institutions, different state formations. So it was a thinking through of that diaspora space emerges, as a concept. And I think of racism and diaspora space very much something which is both to be analyzed at the structural level, at the level of experience, at the level of subjectivity, and at the level of identity. So those four elements are very central to theorizing of the diaspora. And in that sense, I think it is still relevant, even though it's 20 years now, this year, that cartographers came out. But I think that thinking is still relevant.
This other part of it about whether this kind of moment of really extreme anti-migrant hysteria has an impact on interactions within what we term diaspora space.
Yes, it absolutely does, because you can't take away the specificity of the experience of refugees and asylum seekers. Because they're coming from war-torn areas, from fleeing poverty, all kinds of oppressions Like they're coming and really sort of facing horrendous situations here when they arrive. There are specificities about that experience which I would not want to address through the concept of diaspora. Because I think there is a sense in which those experiences have to be thought through, only partly though, not entirely, have to be given that specificity of what are their experiences, what are their needs. You know, if there are communities that have to settle here, what are their needs? But having said that, these groups, when they come and settle, they live side by side, existing diaspora, they interact with them. In the fullness of time, they probably will form diasporas, either new ones or, you know, already merged into the existing ones. So in a sense, the diaspora space actually does incorporate them because it is about the specificity of different categories of people when they come and interact and their life situations.
And of course, as you know better than me, Ugandan Asians came
Absolutely.
carrying just what they could carry.
Exactly.
And yet, what you partly described is through the lens of...
And now they're a diaspora, yeah, exactly. They started as it.
I think the last question again is the kind of going forward. Feel free to abandon this question, but just in case. What, you know, I'm asking everyone on campus, what do you think the key challenges are for anti-racists today, and what's the role of intellectual in these challenges, which, as you understand, is kind of the underlying conversation of the whole 2 days.
Yes. So can you say the first part?
So what are the key challenges?
The key challenges today, yes.
And then intellectual.
I think one of the things that I think about, we talk about, not just talk about, is the reality of many different racisms that stalk the world today. Anti-Semitism, anti-Muslim racism, anti-Roma racism, color-coded racism, xenophobic racism. What we need to be constantly vigilant is that each of these racisms kind of both position us and construct us in relation to other groups in ways in which they can divide us. So someone, as an Asian, you know, I can be racist towards African people. As a Jewish person, you can be racist towards Muslim, and vice versa. So these racisms have the capacity to divide us. So one of the things I feel it is a challenge for us, both intellectually, but also politically outside, to make sure that they don't divide us. That we create a politics of coalition politics, which take that on board centrally. It's not easy, as we knew recently, we had all that thing with Ken Livingstone. It's not an easy thing because so many different kind of, you know, agendas are at stake. But I think that that is something, and I'm sure in universities, this kind of issues are there as well. So that is something that I feel is a big challenge, you know, that we must do. Intellectually, I think we all obviously know, in fact, people sitting here are all involved in these projects, you know. Probably they know better than I do at the moment, you know, all the sort of things that we need to be thinking about. But it is to be thinking about the way, the forms that racism takes in this new conjuncture. So analyzing them and theorizing them, and then developing a politics on the basis of that analysis. So I think that's a big challenge, actually. That's a big challenge. You know, what is the current kind of conjuncture, as Stuart Hall used to talk about, that in which we have to, and we have to also, transnational feminism, resources of transnational feminism are very relevant, I feel, because transnational feminism always places at the center the global politics. And in fact, when we talk about the immigrants, migrants kind of coming here, We know that all these wars that are raging in the world, you know, the foreign policies of our countries, you know, all the things that are creating these problems and poverty. When in the 80s and the 90s, I mean, maybe this is happening now too, but perhaps I'm not aware of it. But, you know, we used to, even if you were not in development studies, you nonetheless took interest in development studies. You looked at the ways in which global inequalities and inequities are created and sustained. I see less of that now. And yet we really need to foreground that. Yeah, because unless we do that, we can't make sense of these migrations. Because these global migrations are underpinned by those kind of what are called development studies paradigms, like, you know, the workings of the IMF, you know, and the World Bank, etc., and the kinds of policies that they impose on third world countries, or what used to be called third world countries, developing countries, and the ways in which poverty is underpinned by the kinds of programs of aid, etc. Aid is not an aid, it's a loan. You know, we always, even our language kind of denies us. You know, we talk about aid because we think, oh, that's great, you know, we've got so many billions of pounds. But actually, they are loans, and which in that country as well. So I feel that transnational feminism actually does that. And it also behoves people, those of us feminists in the sort of, you know, in the north, to always think about their own relationship of power. And power is actually something that we have to understand all the time. Power. And that our relationship to women and men in the South, global South, is actually mediated through power dynamics, which applies to us as well, those people of color too. We actually hold a position of power vis-a-vis poor people in the global South. We have to be, so you develop a politics that actually has that understanding. And so I think, yes, I think probably maybe that's the thing that I would emphasize, is the resources of transnational feminism would be very, so that we are actually looking at the patriarchal systems both at the global level and the local level, but also questions of class and questions of gender and questions of disability and all the intersectional kind of issues and questions we can foreground them.
That's great. I think that's a great place to end this formal bit. So please. This time, and I'm very sorry we didn't have them last time, we have microphones. So please, again, what I'd like to do is take 2 or 3 questions, but as it's only me with the mic, you have to indicate where you are in the room so I can drop one off. Then I'll run back and try and take the question, or maybe I could give one set to my friend here. Okay, sorry. Oh no, that's not working, sorry. Sorry, it's not working, is it?
Thank you very much for your talk. I was just going to ask a brief question about intersectionalism, how that relates to it being an external model versus as an internal sort of way of processing your place in the world. And I was wondering if you would, what things might come if that sort of way of internally looking at the structures outside, how that might, with the example of, just as an example, veganism as being sort of brought into that intersection in terms of looking at violence and power and how that was used, how that as an example of that.
I wonder if we could take at least 2 or 3 so other people get to speak and then let Abdar come back. Is there someone else who'd like to? Oh. All right. You see, people couldn't hear you behind you last time, so let's see if the other mic works. The issue is not in front, it's behind, you see.
First of all, thank you, Talo, for a wonderful presentation. One word that you didn't use in talking about intersection...
You tried pushing the red button, sorry.
Press the button.
I don't know if that's going to work again. It's not. Is it not working?
You know, you talked about race. Doesn't matter. You talked about race, class, and gender. But one word that you didn't use at all, not once, was religion. And I posed that question because of this Rushdie affair and the impact that that had on anti-racist politics. Because I know that in your book, in Cartography, you really defend the kind of political black. You really give a rationale for that in terms of post-colonial struggles and anti-slavery, and that there was a kind of coming together against some notion of West and white imperialism, yeah? But it seems that the Rushdie affair really split, formed new kind of political identification. The Women Against Fundamentalism, and you were involved with Southall Black Sisters, took a very strong stance on that. I was involved in the Asian Youth Movement, which was torn asunder because of that, yeah? Funding was removed. And religion was the only thing that got funded, yeah? So my question to you is, and today we've seen some of the kind of consequences of that is lots of young Muslim, Sikhs and Hindus and others affirming religious identity as their form of anti-racism, and Tariq Madood and others have kind of rationalised that. So what is your view? Was that a good intervention, or was it a bad intervention?
What was it?
Religion, politics of religion, in the evolution of anti-racism. Yeah.
If we want to take these 2 questions, one about the internal intersectionality and
can you explain a bit more? I wasn't quite sure that I understood the question.
I don't know if you could, the questioner could just try and restate your question once more, please. Sorry. The mic's not working, so we're just going to have to... Bless you, thank you.
In intersectionalism, if one of the criticisms of intersectionalism has been that it sort of tries to cluster together sort of external sort of axes, by some critics. But I suppose I was more drawing out the positive kind of attempts that have been made to see how, as a sort of structure, how it can change one's view on things more generally, and in terms of sort of violence and power, the important how human society might go forward. And then I use the example of veganism as a sort of case in point of power and violence, subjugation, etc.
What I would say is that those structures that you're saying, external structures, I think I would probably see through what I just said earlier on, which is that the external structures work in tandem with, in articulation with, not just in tandem with, but in articulation with questions of identity, questions of subjectivity, questions of experience, so they work together. And in that sense, they're not just external structures. If the criticism is that they're external structures, they're not just external structures, they're also about experience, you know. Does that, it doesn't still answer your question.
Anyway, perhaps we should, whether or not it does, perhaps we should move on to go to the question about...
Well, I think your question, what you just said is absolutely right, you know. In fact, when I was thinking about it, religion was obviously on my mind because we were talking about the fracturing of the figure of the black and then of the Asian even, you know. Because we used to talk about Asians, but you can't talk about Asians anymore, almost, you know. We talk about Muslims and Hindus and Sikhs So yes, but you can't answer that in a straightforward way because it's quite a complex thing. The thing about you can organize around religion, which is not automatically fundamentalist. And therefore, I think we need to make a distinction between fundamentalist organizations and organizing around religion. That's one point. But I think you're right that there was a point, and I think it probably still is the case, that religious groups get more funding from the state than not. And that I'm not very happy about. And yes, there are ways in which religion does divide. It can bring people together, but it does divide people as well. And it has had that effect over the last 30 years. And the Rushdie affair was the time when that began to happen.
Someone would like to speak right up there.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask, you're talking about fundamentalist groups. How would you define that?
Well, it's not a simple definition. Fundamentalist groups are groups that actually construct. They're not necessarily, they can be historical tradition, but they construct certain aspects of the tradition as if those are the literal fundamental issues which then, in fact, act against certain groups of people. So for example, you know, if a group wants to take women, for example, women's position, you know, if they want to kind of endorse a patriarchal system, then that is a fundamentalist group. If it actually takes a very political stance on that, I mean, you might actually say, well, yes, you know, in one sense, you know, all kinds of patriarchal features in society can be seen as fundamental. But there is a difference between political organizing. The fundamental groups are political groups that actually construct certain groups in certain negative ways, and they have impact on them. Or at least that's how I see them.
Could you give examples of contemporary expressions of that, like group organizations, organizations?
Well, I can't give you one example. I think there are all kinds of groups that are there are Christian fundamental groups, there are Sikh fundamental groups, there are Muslim fundamental groups, there are all kinds of fundamental groups, you know. In all religions mainly actually have a fundamental strand within them.
Can I ask then that, because I always wanted to ask different things, so do you think that the phrase fundamentalist is exclusively about religious groupings, or could there be a kind of, because when you're speaking, of course, right, how can you not hear what you're saying and not think that the remaking of the Republican Party under Trump is a certain kind of use of a political vehicle to herald certain kinds of traditional values, sexual violence among them, you know? But it's not claiming God.
But it is fundamentalist, yes.
Sorry, Aaron, where's the other one? Because you've got them both because it's sorry.
Okay.
The issue is not whether we can hear, it's whether people there can hear. Which is why it's better to wait.
Yeah, seriously.
Sorry about that. Maybe we should leave one please so the front part of the room.
I was told I had a desk job.
Very, very sorry about that.
No, it's fine.
Do you want to leave that one?
So I found it very amazing to hear your genealogy of how you developed your agenda through your personal engagement. So I was thinking myself how I started to engage in some issues. And I started thinking about my first important march. That was the Genoa against the G8 in 2001. And the first day we had an important, significant rally on the right to free movement. So the first day was a fundamental anti-racist day. And what I see today as very problematic is the connection that was very clear that day between the critique of capitalism as global creation of divisions, exploitations, destruction of nature, etc., and racism. So, in this connection between class, gender, and race, today the weak link, from my point of view, in political terms, is class. So, how can we retry a way to empower the class approach, the anti-capitalist approach, in order to strengthen also the other two or many aspects of this connection?
I agree with you that we need to think of class alongside. The thing is that I suppose some of us, I always worry about class-centric approaches. But it's very important. Class is a very, very important dynamic. As I said, if you want to understand inequalities, global inequalities, you can't understand them without the ways in which capitalism operates. You can't. So you've got to think about class. You've got to think about, capitalism and how it operates. But class has to work with other issues as well, about gender, about other questions as well. So I agree with you that class is very important. But somebody sent me a piece which he's a famous professor whose name I don't remember, but he's a very famous economist who's actually arguing that in America, in the present juncture, that it is not actually class that is important in terms of the election of Trump, rather it is race. And I actually kind of, somebody sent me, a friend sent me this, and I said on Facebook, I agree that race is very, very important in this juncture. But I think that race is also has interlinks with class. And somebody said, oh my God, I get so furious with all these left wing. She got very upset with me that I was actually saying, not agreeing with her, that actually class was not an important thing alongside race in there. But I do think that the interrelationship has to be always kept in mind.
We try and take 2 more questions if there are comments, contributions. I know people are flagging a bit now. See, that's why I tried to feed you sugar earlier. Now it's in the slumping kind of part of the afternoon.
Yeah.
It's nearly time. Should we back after and then have a brief breath of air before we finish? Is that a better thing? Well, thank you. That was a wonderful session. And thank you.